Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's virtual policy briefing and interactive workshops ending nuclear weapons before they end us, opportunities under the Biden administration to take action. Today's event is being convened by the Back from the Brink campaign and the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. My name is Danny Hall, Director of Public Affairs for Soka Gakkai International USA, and a member of the Back from the Brink campaign facilitating group. I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to thank the many individuals serving on the working group that organized today's event, representing a broad range of organizations, including Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, Arms Control Association, United Church of Christ, Justice and Witness Ministries, Union of Concerned Scientists, Outrider Foundation, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Soka Gakkai International USA, Sierra Club, Peace Action, Pax Christi USA, Friends Committee on National Legislation, and Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. I'd also like to thank the over 40 partner organizations that have actively supported today's event. Thank you so much for all your support. Two important events provide a backdrop for today's program. The new Biden administration was inaugurated on January 20th, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, entered into force on January 22nd. While the Biden administration has a lot on its plate, we want to use this event to send a message that not only do we need to reduce nuclear risk, we need to prioritize the complete elimination of nuclear weapons because we are running out of time before they eliminate us. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has moved the doomsday clock closer to midnight than it has ever been in its history. And as over 50 former NATO government leaders and defense ministers shared in an open letter last September about the urgent need to abolish nuclear weapons, we must not allow ourselves to sleepwalk into a catastrophe of even greater proportions than the catastrophe we've experienced this year with the COVID pandemic by neglecting the nuclear threat. So with this event, we call on the Biden administration to go beyond the step-by-step approach and prioritize the urgent need to eliminate nuclear weapons. This event also aims to help mobilize the grassroots base of support necessary to create the political will for a fundamental change in U.S. nuclear weapons policy at the federal level. This is reflected in the structure of today's event. We will begin with a policy briefing consisting of an expert panel discussion and Q&A session. For the members of our audience tuning in today, please note that the chat function will be disabled, but questions can be submitted through the Q&A function. Simply type your question in and indicate the panelist to whom you would like to direct your question. After the panel discussion and Q&A, we will then have breakout workshops via Zoom meetings to get more information and help you take the ideas that will be discussed today and translate them into meaningful action at the grassroots level. You should have received an email with all the links to the workshops. If you can't find them, no problem. They are all listed on the Back from the Brink website, preventnuclearwar.org, and we will post that link in the chat as well. After the event, we will email each of you a link to an event resources and action page with background information on each of today's panel and workshop topics, video recordings from today's event, and a list of actions you can begin taking. So let's begin with our panel discussion. We will start by covering growing geopolitical dangers and emerging risks, and end by covering solutions from three perspectives. One, the TPNW as the international mechanism to eliminate nuclear weapons. Two, the Back from the Brink campaign as a U.S. pathway to eliminate nuclear weapons by building grassroots power and generating the political will for a fundamental change in U.S. nuclear weapons policy at the federal level, thereby paving the way for multilateral negotiations to bring all nuclear weapon states into compliance with and formal membership with the TPNW. And three, opportunities for the Biden administration to take action. I'm going to be introducing our panelists one by one before they speak. Our first two panelists will be covering geopolitical dangers and emerging risks. First up is Dr. Zia Mian. Zia Mian is a physicist and co-director of Princeton University's Program on Science and Global Security, part of the School of Public and International Affairs. He also directs the program's Project on Peace and Security in South Asia. He received the 2014 Linus Pauling Legacy Award for his accomplishments as a scientist and as a peace activist in contributing to the global effort for nuclear disarmament and for a more peaceful world. In 2018, he was selected as one of the 60 faces of CND by the UK Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament to mark its 60th anniversary. He also received the American Physical Society's 2019 Leo Szilard Award for promoting global peace and nuclear disarmament. He also serves on the board of the Arms Control Association. Zia, welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Danny. My task today is to talk about the current dangers of nuclear war that we face today and looking forward. So my brief remarks are going to focus on what is the danger of nuclear war today, and how do we understand it, and what are some of the processes, the geopolitical processes that are creating this danger of nuclear war. The first point I want to make is that we do not know how great is the danger of nuclear war today in absolute terms, and we cannot even imagine this danger, because it is actually impossible to know all the different paths that could lead to war and all the ways in which a war today could turn into a nuclear war. The history of the last more than 100 years, certainly throughout the 20th century, has taught us that no one can know how the smallest events can spiral in unforeseen, unexpected ways through actually existing political structures and decision-making by leaders into wars that have absolutely catastrophic consequences. What we do know is that out of the 193 countries in the world today, there are only 9 countries that could start a nuclear war, since only those 9 countries actually have control of nuclear weapons. And everybody should know these 9 countries. I mean, this is one of the great central political facts of our time, and that is that it's the United States, Russia, Britain, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. This is where the nuclear danger lives. It is the nuclear war machines that are managed, funded, and operated by political and military institutions of these countries that are the source of the danger that imperils humankind with nuclear war. We also know for certain that while we do not know the paths that can lead us to nuclear war, we do know that it is only in a world without nuclear weapons that we can be sure that no war can turn into a nuclear war. So how great is the danger today? Even if we don't know it in absolute terms, do we have a sense of how it is compared to what it's been like in the past? One way to ask this question is looking back in the historical record and looking back at the judgments of people who've lived through the history of the nuclear age. And one person who has tried to help us understand this is former US Secretary of Defense, William Perry. And he recently issued his own judgment looking back on a life spent working on nuclear weapons at the highest levels of decision-making in the United States. And his judgment is, and I quote, "Today, the danger of some sort of a nuclear catastrophe is greater than it was during the Cold War." And Bill Perry's judgment, this danger is greater than it was during the Cold War, includes the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And Perry knows this because he was there. He was actually working in the CIA, looking at photos of the Soviet missiles in Cuba that were then being sent to the White House for President Kennedy to decide what to do. And Perry has said that, "I thought every day when I went back to my hotel, it was the last day of my life. It was the end of civilization, and I thought it was about to happen." So that's one judgment of where we are today. Now, a second judgment is offered by Daniel Ellsberg, who was also there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but working in the White House. And in his book, The Doomsday Machine, Daniel Ellsberg has explained that the US nuclear war plan that was in place at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis was expected by the US military and understood by President Kennedy and the White House that the war plan would lead to the immediate deaths of over 600 million people within 6 months if nuclear war was carried out according to the US war plan. This didn't include the deaths of people in the United States. This is how many the US military anticipated killing if they started nuclear war. Now, Ellsberg also was there and understood that the risk of nuclear war was not understood by President Kennedy and the people around him. They only knew that it was high. Kennedy himself is said to have believed that there was a 30% to 50% chance of nuclear war. And as I mentioned, Perry believes that the risk today is greater. We also know the risks of what was in play that led people to run this kind of risk of nuclear war. We know from the historical record that in the discussions in the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the question was actually asked, what is the strategic impact on the position of the United States of the new Soviet missiles in Cuba? In other words, what difference does it make to us now that the Soviet missiles in Cuba? How significantly does this change the strategic balance between the United States and the Soviet Union? Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara told the president, this changes nothing at all for us. This is not a military problem we are facing. It is a political problem. So my first point was that we don't know the risk of war, and people, even at the highest levels, disagree and don't understand the actual risk. And the second is that the source of the problem and the willingness to run this risk is not because of some objective military threat, it is because of judgments about politics. So what is the political problem today that where the US and others who are in charge of nuclear weapons are willing to run the risk of nuclear war? The issue we face is that the United States, since the end of the Cold War, has wanted to ensure its overwhelming power in international politics. Not just in some abstract means, but an absolute overwhelming power in comparison to all others. And this is simply not a future that other countries are willing to share. And this has been codified, in the early days after the Cold War, by the Defense Department, where it was determined that the first objective of US policy is to prevent the re-emergence of a new rival. And our goal should be to prevent any hostile power from dominating any region where it could be possible for it to become a significant threat to the United States. In other words, we won't even allow the emergence of regional powers in this post-Cold War world. And what we've seen instead of this absolute US domination is that in the case of Russia, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been a determined effort by Vladimir Putin and others to make Russia great again. They are not willing to accept second-class status, at least in their region. And so we've seen an increasing level of tension as the US and NATO have expanded to Russia's borders, and Russia has tried to push back in ways to assert its power, including through the use of force and violence and threats. But ultimately, the issue is about who gets to decide what happens in the Russian neighborhood and the role of Russia in the international system, and the US trying to control the structure of global politics. The second region, which is of great concern, is of course East Asia, where the rise of China over the past 30 years is seen as a challenge to the United States. China is basically surrounded by US allies and military bases and military forces in the South China Sea and in Japan and various other US allies in the region. And as China rises and seeks to assert its dominance in its neighborhood, the US is seeking to push China back from having regional power and the possibility of global power in the future. So this tension between the US effort to ensure its absolute and its relative dominant position is clashing with the efforts by Russia to reassert its historical rights and power in the region, and of China to assert its newfound role because of its rising economy and political power in its region. Ultimately, the issue that leads this and connects this to nuclear weapons, of course, is that the fragile architecture of nuclear restraint that was put in place during the Cold War, when people understood that war could become nuclear war and would have catastrophic consequences, is that the US has been withdrawing from nuclear arms control treaties and is committed to modernizing its entire nuclear arsenal, as have other nuclear armed states. And so what we face is a future of continuing geopolitical competition with a new generation of nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and submarines that will be at play. My last point is actually about the new nuclear nations that have emerged since the Cold War, especially in South Asia, where India and Pakistan have a history of nuclear wars, and now both have nuclear weapons. And what we see is that any tension between them has the risk of spiraling into a nuclear war, especially since Pakistan threatens the first use of nuclear weapons in a conflict. And the most recent understanding of the effects of nuclear war by climate change scientists has led us to understand that even a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, never mind a war between the US and Russia or between the US and China, a limited war between India and Pakistan, where they only use a few tens of weapons against each other's cities, would have disastrous global consequences for human beings and for agriculture and for nature. The possibility of a nuclear winter starting from even a low-level nuclear war has become an increasing concern and adds a whole new level of risk to our understanding of what is the nuclear threat we face today. So with that, I will end my remarks.
Thank you very much, Zia. Our next panelist, who will further expand on the topic of growing geopolitical dangers and emerging risks, is Michael Clare. Michael Clare is the Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College. He now serves as a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C. From 1985 to 2018, he was the Five College Professor of Peace and World Security Studies, a joint appointment at Amherst, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke, and Smith Colleges, and the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He has written widely on international peace and security, arms control and disarmament, and global resource politics. He's the author of 15 books, including most recently Resource Wars 2001, Blood and Oil 2005, The Race for What's Left 2012, and All Hell Breaking Loose, Climate Change, Global Chaos, and American National Security 2019. He's also the defense correspondent of The Nation and has written for many other journals, including Arms Control Today, Current History, Foreign Affairs, Harper's, Le Monde Diplomatique, Newsweek, Scientific American, and Technology Review. Michael, welcome to the panel.
Hello, everyone. And I'm so honored to be participating in this amazing event. And I want to congratulate the sponsors for putting this together. I'm going to continue where Zia left off, emphasizing the geopolitical factors that lead to nuclear war. And I'm going to be showing some slides. So I will be now sharing my screen. And I want to make the key point that we have to think about not just nuclear weapons, the weapons themselves, but also the geopolitical environment in which a decision to employ nuclear weapons might be made, which is exactly what Zia was talking about. At this moment, I think it's highly unlikely that any of the nuclear armed states will employ nuclear weapons in a deliberate fashion, what people call a bolt out of the blue. But in the current geopolitical environment, all of the nuclear armed powers are prepared to use nuclear weapons if a conflict has begun and their non-nuclear conventional forces are deemed to be at risk. Looking back, we have to remember that the geopolitical factor was present at the very dawn of the nuclear age. The first and only use of nuclear weapons occurred at the end of an epical struggle between the major powers of the time for control of the European heartlands, Europe and Asia. And in that epical struggle, it was believed that the way to break the will of the enemy power was to destroy their cities and their industrial heartlands. by using massive bombing and firebombing, as in Tokyo, and the destruction of Dresden. And this was considered legitimate. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a natural consequence of that mode of thinking. During the Cold War, the major powers of the time, the US and the USSR, again engaged in an unremitting struggle for control of the Eurasian heartland. And as during World War II, both sides assumed that any war between them would eventually involve strikes on the homeland of the other side, and including attacks on their major cities and industrial centers. Of course, this time fought entirely with nuclear weapons, leading to massive destruction, as Zia Mian told us. And to ensure that if either side sought to achieve victory with the use of conventional weapons, conventional forces through a massive attack, like a massive tank attack, both sides deployed what they call tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons in Europe, so that at the beginning of any conflict, it would immediately escalate to the nuclear level, such as you see, the Pershing II and the Soviet SS-20 battlefield nuclear weapons. But the deployment of those battlefield nuclear weapons precipitated a massive anti-nuclear movement around the world. Millions of people demonstrated. And I highlight that today because we have to remember that throughout the past 50 years, peace movements have had a dramatic impact. And we have to remember we can do that again, because the massive protests of the 1980s led to the signing of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, which banned those kind of battlefield nuclear weapons. And from that point on, there was a severing of the links between conventional and nuclear weapons. And when the Cold War ended, this kind of geopolitical contestation largely subsided. And so the use of nuclear weapons became far less conceivable. And President Obama, in this environment, sought to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons. And I have a quote here from his famous speech in April 2009 in Prague, when he said, to put an end to Cold War thinking, we will reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy and urge others to do the same. But today, after a hiatus of nearly 30 years, the major world powers are again contending for geopolitical advantage on both sides of the Eurasian heartland, as Zia laid out very clearly. And all three are preparing for major conventional engagements that could easily escalate to the nuclear level. This new strategic environment, called great power competition in the US military literature, was first described by Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis in 2018, in which he said it's no longer terrorism that will define our military policy, but the primary focus is now on long-term strategic competition among the great powers. And this led to the two documents which continue to govern US military policy today: the National Defense Strategy of 2018 and the Nuclear Posture Review, also of 2018. The NDS identifies China and Russia as America's principal adversaries and says the US military must be prepared for full-scale, high-intensity combat with those countries, and it's expected that such combat will entail the use of the most advanced conventional weapons available, and it might entail significant risk of nuclear escalation. And the Nuclear Posture Review calls for the complete replacement of all nuclear weapons in the US arsenal with more modern and capable replacements, and the acquisition of low-yield nuclear munitions to allow the president the option of a tailored or flexible nuclear response. So we're going back to where we were during the Cold War. In accordance with the NDS, the US military is now preparing to fight and defeat Russian and Chinese forces on or near their own territory. And I emphasize this because of the extreme danger. And we don't have time for me to really explain this chart. This is a US Army chart explaining how the Army will fight and defeat Russia in a future war in Europe. But the essence is that US forces on outside, it says US forces outside, there will be a convergence of all kinds of modern weaponry on Russian heartland, their main military assets, their air defenses, their radars, their command and control. Once those are destroyed, US forces will move inside and destroy what's left of the Russian military. And to enhance this ability of the US to fight inside Russian and Chinese territory, the US has withdrawn from the INF Treaty, allowing for the deployment of missiles with ranges banned by that treaty, and accelerated the development of hypersonic missiles that go more than 5 times the speed of sound and are in INF prohibited ranges. Also, in accordance with the Nuclear Posture Review, the US has commenced the installation of a low-yield nuclear warhead. Low yield means it's not quite as big as Hiroshima, but approaching that size on submarines, and is planning a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. All of this is contributing to a significantly enhanced risk of a nuclear event. The combination of a geopolitical stance emphasizing intense competition with Russia and China, and a military doctrine favoring attacks with advanced conventional weapons on Russian and Chinese territory increases the risk of nuclear war in 2 ways. First, by multiplying the risks of military clashes near Russia or Chinese territory with escalatory consequences. And I want to tell you, every day, US bombers and warships are probing close up to Russian and Chinese territory. This is the USS Nimitz, which was close up to Chinese territory under Biden just a month ago. Secondly, the risk is increasing by eroding the distinction between conventional and nuclear attacks, by deploying these INF prohibited hypersonic weapons and other advanced conventional weapons that close the fire break between nuclear and conventional weapons and threaten the key assets of Russia and China, making it more likely that they might use nuclear weapons in a clash. And I have a quote here from Vladimir Putin saying that in the event of aggression with conventional weapons that threatens the existence of the state, we're prepared to use nuclear weapons. And I'm sure China has a similar policy. And under those circumstances, the US could use nuclear weapons first. So to conclude, it seems to me that we have some important actions and policies that we have to take. In addition to opposing the weapons themselves, we have to oppose the geopolitical policies and military doctrines that make nuclear weapons use more likely, and specifically to repudiate the great power competition strategy embedded in the National Defense Strategy, to repudiate the Nuclear Posture Review with its call for low-yield nuclear weapons, to repudiate military strategies that call for conventional attacks on Russian and Chinese territory and cease provocative air and naval maneuvers on Russia and China's borders, and to initiate high-level talks with Russia and China to minimize threats from hypersonic weapons and other emerging technologies, and hopefully to negotiate a new tripartite INF treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Our next three panelists will be focusing on solutions. First up, speaking on the topic of the TPNW as the international mechanism to eliminate nuclear weapons, is Beatrice Finn. Beatrice Finn is the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning campaign coalition that works to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. Ms. Finn has over a decade of experience in disarmament diplomacy and civil society mobilization through her work with ICAN, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Geneva Center for Security Policy. She has written extensively on weapons law, humanitarian law, civil society engagement in diplomacy and multilateral institutions, and gender perspective on disarmament work. Beatrice, welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much, Danny. And thank you everyone for being here today. It's really, really nice to participate in this event. I want to start by, just a huge gratitude to Back from the Brink campaign and all the US partners of ICAN for putting this event together and also for organizing and keeping this conversation so active right now. And I think it's a really important moment to have this conversation today. And I want to start by, before going into the TPNW more specifically, I want to start by kind of highlighting why right now is such an important moment to raise this issue, and not just because of the issues that Sia and Michael raised about the risks of nuclear weapons use, but we've seen 500,000 Americans die from a pandemic. I mean, the number is almost unimaginable to think about, 500,000 people. And we do know that climate change will have an even worse impact on American lives and society in the coming decades. It will be a devastating impact. There's been a huge sort of reckoning of racism this past years, where people have started to really kind of articulate and clarify how the institutions built to protect Americans are actually harming so many people. And we have a huge sort of movement around gender equality that's starting to question the policies of sort of that are ingrained in toxic masculinity in terms of problem solving, this idea that we can threaten and bully people into submission. And of course, in the backdrop of this, an enormous economic injustice situation where inequalities are growing. And we've seen that in the recent sort of COVID relief packages, how the weapons companies that want to make new nuclear weapons pretty much gets blank checks from taxpayers' money. But the country cannot afford to pay a $15 minimum wage to the people that they claim to be essential workers, to have kept our society alive and running throughout this pandemic, or give $2,000 to American families that are struggling through this huge economic crisis. So I think that that's, as a backdrop also, these are all issues that are extremely relevant when we talk about security and what protects us, and how to look at nuclear weapons from those perspectives is extremely, I think there's a readiness from people to start linking nuclear weapons with these issues right now. And I think it's something that we need to take advantage of. So I think that's why it was such a remarkable moment on 22nd of January, when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force. A huge moment that was marked by celebration and commemoration around the world, including loads of dozens of protests in the US at nuclear weapons laboratories, at bases, universities, contributing to nuclear weapons. We saw a really huge turnout, despite the very challenging kind of conditions for organizing right now through the pandemic. And the treaties entering into force was really a hugely significant moment for international law and peace and security. And sometimes these treaties don't seem particularly important in that moment when they appear, but we can really see over the decades later what an enormous impact they have on shifting our world and shifting our behavior. And this treaty really follows on to such crucial instruments as the UN Charter that regulates when you can use how you can use war, and the Geneva Conventions on how to protect civilians in conflicts, the Biological Weapons Convention that bans bioweapons, the ban on chemical weapons, the ban on landmines, and now also we have a treaty banning nuclear weapons. And it's going to be growing in importance over the next decades, this treaty. So while we of course want to see immediate impact, I think this is something that these kind of treaties and these instruments are tools that we can use to shift behavior and kind of shepherding countries into behaving in a certain way in the future. And the treaty really builds on activism, decades of activism and leadership of survivors and impacted states to eliminate nuclear weapons. So I just want to quickly run through a little bit of what the treaty includes. It really breaks new legal ground. It's the first comprehensive treaty that bans all activities related to nuclear weapons, and it provides a pathway for the elimination of nuclear weapons. It has two specific parts that are very close to me, and I really think is groundbreaking in terms of that it requires assistance for victims of nuclear weapons use and testing, and to remediate impacted environments. And it also recognizes the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons that it has on women and girls, and of course also indigenous communities. And these kind of things are stuff that we can build on in the future, and to make these links with the other issues that people are talking about. The treaty has the support of, was adopted by over a majority of states in the world, and the number of signatures and states parties continues to grow. Just last week, Comoros and Philippines became the latest states to ratify the treaty, bringing up to 54. And we know that many more are going to come in the future. And even in countries that don't yet support this treaty, we see really how polls shows that the public support these kind of instruments and supports the TPNW. Cities are not happy being targets of nuclear weapons, and support the treaty and wants the treaty to be the governments to join the treaty. And also many parliamentarians and political representatives in countries are starting to support this treaty. Actually, 64% of Americans, according to a recent poll, supports joining the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And the treaty will really have an impact, even if the United States have not yet signed it. The implementation of the TPNW by the states parties will make a difference. For example, on the victim assistance and environmental remediation provisions, which can create new international standards for addressing nuclear weapons humanitarian harm, and really have a concrete impact on the communities that have been impacted by these weapons. And of course, further research on implementing verification articles can help advance knowledge and progress on how to verify nuclear disarmament. And all states parties in this treaty are now legally bound to get more countries to join the treaty and to promote the universalization of the treaty, meaning that these 54 states that are now states parties will work as a group to mobilize and bring in more countries and kind of build a new norm around this treaty. And of course, also we've seen in the past for other treaties that there's a normative power of international law that also kind of impacts the states outside the treaty. For example, past weapons prohibitions have shown that even states that are not parties, they start to modify and change their behavior to comply and move towards this new international treaty. We've seen that with the Mine Ban Treaty, with the Chemical Weapons Convention, with the Biological Weapons Convention and Cluster Munitions Conventions. For example, we have seen with the landmines and cluster munitions that companies producing the banned weapons, even in countries that have not joined the treaty, stopped. Countries change policy on use and transfers, and financial institutions start divesting from producing companies. So for the TPNW and the United States, the US, of course, has not joined the TPNW yet, but it will start feeling the impact of this treaty as it has done with other weapons prohibitions it has not yet joined. Pressure is growing in the United States to join the treaty, with civil society organizations calling for it, cities joining the ICANN Cities Appeal and the Back from the Brink initiatives. Public conversations, public pressure, Congress supports, and public opinion are starting to grow in favor of this. And the Biden administration right now has the opportunity to reverse previous administrations' kind of ineffective and unhelpful approach to the treaty. And of course, first and foremost, the Biden administration should stand on the right side of history and sign the TPNW and submit it to the Senate for the ratification. But of course, also in the meantime, it should really take steps when it comes to come into compliance with the treaty, to set this new standard in international law, including stopping the production of any new nuclear weapons and negotiate further cuts on worldwide nuclear arsenals. The US government now has an opportunity to really look at this treaty as a helpful contribution, as a tool that can be used to get the world closer to nuclear disarmament. We know that it will take time. We've had 75 years with nuclear weapons. It's going to take time to reverse course. But the treaty can be this really helpful tool to start shifting perceptions and start moving away from nuclear weapons towards a different type of security scenario. So this is really, a very exciting time and a really crucial time. The risk of nuclear weapons use is increasing, but we're also seeing huge public mobilization to challenge these sort of established methods of carrying out national security. So this is really the right moment to get engaged and to get involved and start growing awareness around this issue and what needs to be done. So I'm really excited also to see these workshops where I think we're going to go into details on really how regular people can contribute to this issue. I think sometimes it feels really overwhelming to people to know what can I do to this issue. So I would really encourage everyone who's here today to join the workshops, to talk about specific ways and to hear on the specific initiatives and ways where people can get involved and really change this issue and change the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Our next panelist, Denise Duffield, will be discussing the Back from the Brink campaign as a U.S. pathway to eliminate nuclear weapons by building the grassroots power needed to generate the political will for a fundamental change in U.S. nuclear weapons policy at the federal level. Denise is the Associate Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles, PSR-LA. She directs PSR-LA's Nuclear Threats Program, which advocates for health protective policies related to nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. Denise leads PSR-LA's participation in the Back from the Brink campaign to bring local communities together to build the public support and political will needed for a fundamental change in U.S. nuclear weapons policy. Denise also works on environmental health and justice issues, addressing the needs of local communities who are impacted by toxic and nuclear contamination and the failure of regulatory agencies to protect them. Denise also serves on the board of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, ANA, a national network of organizations that works to address issues of nuclear weapons production and waste cleanup. Denise, welcome to the panel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Danny, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us here today. I'd like to give a very special thank you to Beatrice and to ICANN. You have shown all of us that with your spirited organizing, dedication, and persistence in the face of incredibly powerful opposition, we can achieve our shared goal of a world without nuclear weapons. Back from the Brink offers a roadmap for nuclear abolition here in the United States. We're calling upon the U.S. to enter negotiations now with other nuclear armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to eliminate their weapons. We also call on the U.S. to unilaterally adopt a number of policies to reduce the danger of nuclear war while these negotiations proceed. And I do have a PowerPoint, and I'd like to call up the first slide. There we go. So what is Back from the Brink? Back from the Brink was conceived in late 2017 as a national initiative inspired by the UN adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the growing alarm over our then president's nuclear saber rattling. The campaign was convened by Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Union of Concerned Scientists with the intention that it not be owned by any group or person, but would instead solicit participation and endorsements from a diverse array of organizations, municipalities, states, and individuals. The idea was to create a simple but scalable way that anyone, any activist, any individual, any organization can engage in their community in a national campaign that helps build political will for fundamental changes in U.S. nuclear weapons policy and nuclear abolition. Today, Back from the Brink is coordinated by representatives from several PSR chapters, Union of Concerned Scientists, Soka Gakkai International USA, United Church of Christ, and the Outrider Foundation. A task force of these and other organizations and individuals meets monthly to plan initiatives. Local chapters of several endorsing organizations such as Pax Christi, Peace Action, and Veterans for Peace have led successful Back from the Brink efforts throughout the country. Next slide. The core of the Back from the Brink campaign is the call for the U.S. to commit to the abolition of nuclear weapons now and to begin detailed negotiations with the other 8 nuclear-armed states that will bring them all into compliance with the TPNW. We also call on the U.S. to take 4 other common-sense policy solutions to reduce the danger of nuclear war as these negotiations get underway. We're calling upon the United States to lead a global effort to prevent nuclear war by renouncing the option of using nuclear weapons first. Until nuclear weapons are abolished, the U.S. should declare that it will never use them first. Ending the sole unchecked authority of any president to launch a nuclear attack, because no one person should have the power to destroy life as we know it. Taking U.S. nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert. The U.S. has 400 missiles in underground silos right now that can be launched within minutes, which presents a very real risk of accidental nuclear war, and canceling the plan to replace its entire arsenal with enhanced weapons. The U.S. plans to spend $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years to replace the entire nuclear arsenal with enhanced weapons. This is an outrageous and unnecessary squandering of our tax dollars, especially at a time of so many urgent human and environmental needs. Next slide. Back from the Brink is a national campaign that's built on local organizing. Members of Congress and the administration won't make nuclear abolition a priority without hearing about it from their constituents. But much of the public has no idea how dangerous, how expensive, how unjust, or just how harmful to health and the environment these weapons are. Back from the Brink seeks to address this problem by engaging local advocates who work in their communities to secure organizational endorsements and local government resolutions in support of our policy platform. This process builds public awareness of the threats posed by nuclear weapons while communicating the urgent need to address this threat to decision makers in Washington, D.C. Next slide. Over 350 health, policy, faith, peace, environmental, and justice groups have endorsed Back from the Brink, from the Sierra Club to Indivisible to the U.S. Conference of Mayors to most major faith denominations to cat lovers against the bomb. If you haven't endorsed yet, please do. Our website is preventnuclearwar.org, and we'll have information on that at the end. Next slide. To date, nearly 50 municipalities and 6 state legislative bodies have voted to adopt resolutions supporting Back from the Brink's policy platform, including major cities like Baltimore, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Tucson, Washington, D.C., Honolulu, Portland, Philadelphia, the state of California, the state of Oregon, the Maine Senate, and the New Jersey Assembly. Next slide. Most Back from the Brink resolutions include a call for the U.S. to embrace the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which means these municipalities and states can join ICANN Cities Appeal. 35 of 37 U.S. cities that are part of ICANN Cities Appeal joined through Back from the Brink resolutions. And here's a photo of Beatrice with Washington, D.C. City Council member David Grosso after the D.C. Adopted its resolution, and with Los Angeles City Council member Paul Koretz, who sponsored our resolution here. Next slide. Back from the Brink activists often customize resolutions to make them more relevant and persuasive to their communities. Some include whereas statements about the impact of a nuclear weapons production facility in the region, or how much money in tax dollars their city spends for nuclear weapons. Some emphasize the environmental health and justice impacts of nuclear weapons mining, production, testing, and waste on US communities. Some communities include support for other disarmament efforts, in addition to Back from the Brink in the TPNW, including divestment, making their city a nuclear weapons free zone, diplomacy with Iran, or a citizens commission to study the impact of the TPNW in the region. Next slide. Back from the Brink can be a great tool for reaching out to local groups and building new relationships and coalitions. For example, to win passage of its Back from the Brink resolution, PSR Oregon pulled together a coalition of health professionals, Hanford Downwinders, Habakasha, the Marshallese community, atomic veterans, and faith, environmental, and justice groups. Next slide. The Syracuse Peace Council also organized many groups in support of their Back from the Brink resolution, and their mayor even declared August 6th Back from the Brink Day. Next slide. It's also really nice to win sometimes. We have been really heartened by responses from municipal and state leaders. Local officials may not have time to read a nuclear weapons policy papers, but they will read a resolution when it's brought to them by their constituents. And many are leaning in. City leaders are asking questions. They're taking time to think critically about nuclear weapons and make a decision on where they stand. We don't see much of that in Congress yet. Also, today's city council member might be tomorrow's US Senator. That's the case for me here in California with US Senator Alex Padilla. Next slide. The US movement for nuclear abolition is growing. Yes, we need to be bigger. We need to be younger, more diverse, and it's a real problem that we aren't. But the good news is that we want to be. Building a diverse movement is one of the most popular workshops today, and there are new efforts to work in solidarity with and center the voices of frontline nuclear communities in the movement. Over 1,000 people registered for this policy briefing. Last summer, nuclear abolitionists came together for Still Here, a beautiful virtual event to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And a few weeks ago, activists throughout the country and the world celebrated the TPNW's entry into force with over 100 events, banner hangings, church bells ringings, all kinds of creative actions. So there is movement in the movement. I think this is truly the beginning of the end of nuclear weapons. Next slide. If you haven't yet, please endorse Back from the Brink and get involved. Our website has an advocacy tools section with organizing guides and sample resolutions, and an interactive map that can help you connect with others. We're always looking for more folks to work with us to grow and manage this campaign, so please email us if you're interested. Our website is pretty easy to remember, preventnuclearwar.org, and the email is info@preventnuclearwar.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. Our final panelist, Tom Countryman, will be talking about opportunities for the Biden administration to take action. Tom is the former U.S. Acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. He is chairman of the board of the Arms Control Association, a nonpartisan NGO which analyzes key security issues and advises the executive branch, Congress, and the public on choices to promote global security and reduce the risk that weapons of mass destruction will be used. He retired from the senior Foreign Service in January 2017 after 35 years of service. At that time, he served simultaneously as Acting Undersecretary for Arms Control and as Assistant Secretary for International Security and Non-Proliferation, ISN. After serving in Belgrade, Washington, and Cairo, he advised Ambassador Albright on Middle East affairs at the U.S. mission to the United Nations and was Director for Near East Affairs at the National Security Council. Prior to his appointment at ISN, he served in Rome, Athens, the Bureau of European Affairs, and the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. Tom, welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much, Danny. And let me thank all the people who did the hard work to organize this today and all of the organizations involved. The Arms Control Association is very proud to partner with you. We're now in our 50th year of questioning conventional wisdom and of helping to make hard choices in national security policy. And the Arms Control Association is very proud to have on its board people like Professor Mian and Professor Clare. Now, the campaign to save the planet from the existential risk of nuclear war is as old as nuclear weapons themselves. But we cannot afford to have it be an eternal struggle. Progress has been steady at times and dramatic at other times, but we still have so far to go. As we advocate for this ultimate goal, as we raise awareness about the continuing threat of nuclear weapons to humanity, we have to at the same time be able to support incremental policy steps that bring us towards that goal. And as we advocate and campaign for those specific policy steps, which is where I spent more of my time, we must never lose sight of that ultimate goal, that there is a purpose and an achievable objective that we can reach. What we expect of the Biden administration is that the president and his team take no steps that will make it harder ultimately to reach that goal. That's the minimum that we have to ask for and demand. But there is a lot more that we should be demanding and that we should be campaigning for. My expectation is that in the year 2020, we will be disappointed at some of the steps that haven't been taken. But at the same time, I expect that we will see more important steps in the direction of a world without nuclear weapons than we've seen from any other president. And I say that because we have not had a president before who was so knowledgeable about nuclear weapons, who had spent so much of his career working with these issues, and also because of the excellence and the commitment of the team that he is putting in place. But to meet that expectation and that hope requires citizen engagement. So let me lay out what I expect and hope will be the most important steps that the president can take. And keep in mind, in our American system, it really depends upon the president. Congress is important, but we need to see initiative from the administration. So the first step, I hope, is that the president gives guidance to the military and political structure under his direction before we initiate the next nuclear policy review. In other words, don't wait a year until the bureaucracy has produced something that's incrementally different from previous administrations, but the president needs to be out ahead and giving direction, for example, on topics such as declaring a US policy of no first use of nuclear weapons, or a slightly different formulation of that, of sole purpose of US nuclear weapons. The president needs to say that we are reducing the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy. And I was heartened to see just yesterday the president use exactly that language in the interim national security strategy that he has issued. That's an example of giving guidance from the top ahead of what the bureaucracy, of which I was a proud part, ultimately produces for presidential decision. I would hope to see that the president say that we are eliminating a couple of programs that were added by the Trump administration, the SL-76-2 missile and the submarine-launched nuclear ballistic missile, and that he seeks a pause in development of the $250 billion program to build new intercontinental missiles, the ground-based strategic deterrent. Beyond these particular steps that I should be part of the guidance to the Pentagon and to the rest of the government, the president's primary task is to initiate a strategic security dialogue with the Russian Federation that will be regular, frequent, intensive and comprehensive. And by comprehensive, I mean there are no topics that are taken off the table by either side. At the same time, I hope to see this administration with NATO allies take the lead on practical steps of risk reduction that will reduce the risk that we run into a conventional conflict in Europe that could lead to an escalation in conflict. The president has to get all of this started, but the role of the Congress cannot be ignored. And I hope in particular that American citizens will ask their representatives in Congress to support legislation that will end sole launch authority. That is the exclusive power of the president without consulting with anybody to initiate the use of nuclear weapons. It was fairly obvious when Donald Trump was president that that was a bad idea, but no matter who is the president, that is too big a power and too big a responsibility to vest in any one person. And that legislation is in front of the Congress now. I also expect the Congress to have some really tough debates about the defense budget in general, about the nuclear weapons budget in particular, which is above $50 billion a year, and very particular about the ground-based strategic deterrent, the new intercontinental missile now under development. I know some people are watching from overseas, and I hope that allies and friends across the world, particularly in Europe, will push the administration to elevate in importance two topics that actually matter to Europeans more than they matter to the US or Russia, and that is maintaining the Open Skies Treaty and finding an alternative to the INF Treaty so that we can avoid the Euro missile race that we saw 40 years ago. None of this is easy. There are entrenched military and industrial interests that intersect with the political interests of many in Congress. And there is genuine concern about the international environment being more dangerous than it was in previous administrations. But those of us who want to see a different direction in nuclear policy have something powerful on our side. A majority of the United States public favors a world in which no country possesses nuclear weapons. And that's a majority of Democrats, independents, and Republicans. It's important to constantly remind our leadership of that fact. Very few Americans think much about nuclear weapons, and even fewer ever contact their representatives in Congress about it. But the fact is that even a small number of contacts, of expressions of concern, make a difference to the views and the votes of senators and representatives. So the mobilization of American opinion and getting it right into the offices and the heads of our leaders in Congress is crucial. We expect a lot of the Biden administration, and I'm going to remain optimistic about the steps forward that can be taken in the next 4 years. But those expectations are only going to be met if American citizens stand up and speak up. So thank you very much. I look forward to good questions.
Thank you very much, Tom. And thank you to all of our panelists for your presentations. We will now begin the Q&A session. For those of you in the audience, you can submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. If you have a question, please introduce yourself, indicate who you'd like the question addressed to. I have someone helping me sort through the questions. We might not be able to get to every question because we have quite a few people joining us today, but we'll do our best to answer as many as possible and respond to those we don't get to after the event. So our first question is for Michael Clare. Does the US Congress have access to US nuclear targeting plans? And how can the US public know if the strike options available to the president include catastrophic, massive attack plans?
I would say that members of Congress don't have access to the secret plans. And after I speak, I think I'll ask Tom Countryman to add to this, because he may know more about it, about the specific question. But Congress certainly knows about the doctrine that lies behind these targeting decisions. The National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, that include the policy of targeting China and Russia with massive numbers of nuclear weapons. They're aware of the doctrine that makes that possible. But I think that Tom Countryman might have more specific answers. The actual target arrays, that would be highly secret information that nobody else would have outside of a few people within the Defense Department.
So Danny, if you want, I'll comment briefly on that question. The Congress does not have regular, ordinary access to the SIOP, which is the various strike options that the president would have. I believe it is important to support those in Congress who have requested more regular briefings so that Congress is at least forced to confront the reality that all of the strike plans result in massive casualties, not just at the target, in the targets of US weapons, but in the United States itself. The questioner asked is, how can the public be reassured that there are no massive strike plans? You can't, because it absolutely does include plans for massive retaliation.
Danny, if I might.
Yes, please.
The situation is actually significantly worse than people imagine in this regard. We know on the record that there was, in fact, a Senate closed session on a classified briefing on the US nuclear war plan by the head of Strategic Command some years ago. And Senator Bob Kerrey, who was there, actually publicly complained on the floor of the Senate after this briefing, in which Senator Kerrey said that the briefers from Strategic Command, the people in charge of the nuclear weapons and the nuclear war plans, were unable or unwilling to give the information that the senators asked for. And senators were given 3 different answers to the question about the war plans and the consequences. They were told that the briefers had not brought that information. Then they were told that the senators were not cleared to receive such classified information. And then they were told that this information had in fact been provided to Senate leadership and to members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And then Kerry revealed that the members of the leadership and the Senate Armed Services Committee had never in fact received any such information. And my colleague Bruce Blair, who some of you may know, who sadly passed away, revealed in 2019, so basically 2 years ago, that this is the first and only joint Democratic Republican Senate hearing to even receive a classified briefing on the US nuclear war plan. And what we know from Senator Kerry is that basically they were not given anything that resembled an answer to the questions they asked. So there is a deliberate process of preventing democratically elected leaders in the United States from understanding and being able to make decisions about the US nuclear war plan.
Thank you. Our next question is for Beatrice. Is it probable that countries like Ireland that have made the TPNW actual domestic law may eventually arrest the leaders of nuclear weapons makers, or for that matter, politicians from nuclear weapons countries when they step onto the soil of the TPNW states' parties? Can this be emphasized and implemented?
Hi. Yeah, thank you for a really great question, which is somehow connected to a little bit to the the question about the International Criminal Court and war crimes and countries having an obligation to arrest leaders that have committed war crimes, for example. The TPNW is in the current way, and in the current way that the national legislation for most TPNW states that have ratified the treaty does not stretch that far. I think that's quite a high bar in terms of, in particular in the case where nuclear weapons, these leaders have not used nuclear weapons, right? Like I think that it will be quite a high bar for those countries. And I think that we have to also recognize the fact that it's, in many ways, the richest countries, some of the most powerful countries in the world that have these weapons, making it quite difficult for a small country, for example, to take those kind of actions towards a very big, military powerful, very rich country that are very dependent on trade. We've already seen in the process how these nuclear armed states have used significant pressure to get countries to not ratify the treaty, threatening to cancel trade negotiations, threatening to stop military collaborations if they even just ratify the treaty. So to be honest, I think that there's limited impact in getting countries to act in that far. But there are, of course, ways to increase the pressure and increase the sort of stigma around these activities. So we're hoping that these countries that have ratified the treaty will speak out louder. We now argue, and campaigners in these countries will argue, that they have an obligation to raise it at the UN Security Council when they have a seat there, in the Human Rights Council. We have, the annual UN debate on gender now in March at the UN, for example. We argue that governments, the states parties to the treaty, should bring up the gendered impact of nuclear radiation, for example, in those forums. We argue that they should go in bilateral meetings in the way that, for example, as a Swede, I say that the Swedish government in trade negotiation with China, we should talk about human rights violation, we should talk about all these kind of issues with the countries that are doing problematic behavior. And we see how that actually influences these countries. There's a reason why China gets very upset when you bring up human rights. There's a reason why Saudi Arabia gets very upset when you bring up women's rights, for example, in these forums. And it's because that pressure, it works and it bothers them, and it doesn't leave, it leaves, it makes sure that we don't leave that unquestioned. And I think that also ties together with many of the conversation here about what to do and how to get politicians to act. It's not just about winning over every single person. It's also about raising the discomfort level. It's been too easy for politicians, and particularly in a country like the United States, to support threatening to mass murder civilians with weapons of mass destruction. And what we're trying to do is not to think that we can change people's minds very quickly or change these governments' minds, but to continue to raise what is acceptable, continue to disturb them, continue to make it harder and difficult and uncomfortable to invest in these weapons, to authorize budgets that we can, this is the power we have. We can't change Donald Trump's mind or Putin's mind or something like that. It's really hard for us to do that, but we can kind of continuously just raise the bar of what's acceptable, and that's in our power to do. So I think that this is a kind of an ongoing process, and ideally we would end up in a situation where every country that has joined this treaty would take such strong actions, put them on blacklist countries. But I think that's too early now. So it's one of those things that we're working to kind of get them to speak out more and more and more and raise the bar for the actions they take.
Thank you very much. Our next question is for Denise. Denise, what advice do you have for folks who may not be connected with a local organization, but really want to work on this issue and have an impact locally? Are there ways that individuals can help build support among local and state officials and other opinion leaders in our communities?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's one of the things that Back from the Brink wants to try to do, is to bring people together. So on our website, we have an interactive map that will show you which organizations have endorsed, where there's resolutions that have happened or are pending. But if you send us an email at info@preventnuclearwar.org, we can, one, help you connect you to organizations that are in your community that you may not know are there. And we can also work with you on what the process is to begin just approaching. You have power. You have an elected, somebody represents you in your city council, somebody represents you in the state, and that's the most powerful voice there is. So please send us an email at info@preventnuclearwar.org. That is one of our favorite kind of emails, and we have had some success doing that.
Great. Thank you so much, Denise. Excuse me. Our next question is for Zia. The next nuclear posture review is being developed right now. What avenues are there for arms control and abolition advocates to influence the elements of the NPR?
The normal process for developing a nuclear posture review is actually fairly closely held. It's not open for public comment or review or participation. And so that's part of the democratic shortfall in nuclear policy making that has emerged in some of the earlier conversation, that there is actually a professional bureaucratic machinery that lives inside the US government and in all the other countries with nuclear weapons, whose job it is to create these policies, rationalizations, justifications, budgets, and to engineer the weapons. And so how advocates for the abolition of nuclear weapons can participate in this is to think about how to tackle this entire machinery rather than worry about one particular nuclear posture review document, because these things come and go. The machine that generates these things should be the focus of attention. Because what it does, and if you read all the nuclear policy reviews of the United States going back the various past administrations, you'll quickly find, as Tom Countryman mentioned earlier, changes are actually incremental. They're not radical changes, even though you might think an administration is fundamentally different than the one that came before. And a close reading of the Obama administration's posture review shows that it's not fundamentally that different from the Trump administration's posture review on many, many issues. And so I think the issue that we have to ask, and the right question is to ask, is what do we do about the nuclear policy making machine that we confront, rather than any particular policy report or document that they produce? And the first part of that is to begin to understand where it lives and how it insulates itself from democratic control. Because what happens is that basically a finished report ends up in the hands of the White House and in Congress and on a website somewhere. And the process of authorship in detail of who wrote what paragraph, who was responsible, who was in the individual meetings where all of this was put in place, is not available in the public domain. And as part of what Beatrice was mentioning, if you're going to make people uncomfortable, if you're going to hold them to account, then it would be really good to have a process to push for nuclear policy review making processes to be as transparent as possible, so everybody can see who wrote what, who was in the meeting where it was decided it's okay, in Beatrice's words, to have so many weapons that commit mass murder, and let them explain to their children, to their families, to their communities, and to everybody else, this is what I did today.
Danny, unmute.
Oh, I apologize. Sorry about that. Thank you, Zia. Our next question somewhat relates to that. It's for Tom. Mr. Countryman, please comment on the role of defense contractors in persuading politicians to continue funding new nuclear weapons programs. How important is the money trail?
In my opinion, the money trail is everything in politics. And I think that it has only gotten worse in recent years. I hope that Mr. Biden's stated priority to fight corruption overseas extends also to greater transparency at home. certainly the contributions of defense firms, not only to political campaigns, but to think tanks and to spokesmen, is an important factor. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that if you simply shine a light on all of the money that flows from the federal government to defense contractors, to defense executives, and then back into congressional campaigns, that would be sufficient to address the question. It is not helpful to question the integrity of every member of Congress who has a strong belief about national security. You have to make the argument on the merits as well, on the steps that will increase rather than decrease our security, and on the question of affordability. What investments in national security, which should be understood to be much broader than military questions, it should include health and environmental questions. What investments in national security are urgent and what can we afford? That's where the battle is going to be won or not. If I could, Danny, seize this to answer another couple of questions very briefly that are in the Q&A. One is about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is very important. In that treaty, which has now been in effect for 51 years, there was created a legal obligation for the 5 nuclear weapon states to work for the abolition of all nuclear weapons. The U.S. has always accepted that legal obligation, but for the last 4 years has not talked about it. It is the very most minimum step that the Biden administration can take to reaffirm that this is a legal obligation that we have to work towards. It's not enough to point out that since the treaty was signed, we have eliminated 85% of the nuclear weapons that once existed. That's good, but it does not relieve the legal obligation to go further. The relationship between the Prohibition Treaty and the NPT is important. There has been a tendency from Washington and Moscow and Paris for the last 4 years to attack aggressively the advocates of the TPNW, and that it somehow detracts from the importance of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's not only wrong logically, it's counterproductive rhetorically. And I have some hope that the Biden administration will stop bad-mouthing the efforts of more than 100 countries around the world to make a real contribution to the goal of abolition of nuclear weapons. And I hope that all advocates of the treaty, of the Prohibition Treaty, will affirm the central role of that other treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and avoid this false description of a conflict between the two.
Yes, thank you very much. Our next question is for Michael. What is the current status of the INF Treaty in U.S. government policy, and how critical is reviving this treaty to preventing nuclear war today?
Well, the INF Treaty was abolished. Trump administration withdrew from it, and then Mr. Putin did the same. So the INF Treaty is no longer in force. I think it's essential to revive it in some other form. Now, China was not a member of the INF Treaty, and China has a lot of intermediate range weapons of that sort that could be covered by a new treaty. So it won't be possible to revive a treaty like that, especially one including China, without the kind of intense talks that Tom Countryman was talking about earlier, of bringing first the US and Russian leaders together for intensive talks and discussions about security threats, and then hopefully extending those talks to include China. The reason why I think this is so important is, as I indicated earlier in my talk, is that all three countries are developing weapons that would have been prohibited by the INF Treaty and pose a very severe threat of bridging the gap between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons, especially hypersonic weapons, which would reduce, because they're so fast, would reduce decision time from 30 minutes with an intercontinental ballistic missile to 5 minutes or 10 minutes for a country that's coming under attack to determine whether it's a nuclear weapon or not, or a conventional weapon, and to decide whether or not to launch its own weapons. So you have a risk where countries will be forced to, or could decide to, put their nuclear weapons on a launch on warning status and have very few minutes to decide whether or not to launch them, and may decide to launch them prematurely. So we get to a much more dangerous environment, which explains why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved their clock closer. So it's very important that, as Tom Countryman said, that US and Russian and US and Chinese, and hopefully all three, conduct these security talks about these new weapons and try to revive an INF treaty or something like it.
Thank you. Our next question is for Beatrice. Do you see any common ground between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states to get rid of their nuclear weapons? What does that solidarity look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a strong feeling amongst the public in pretty much all over the world. And I think that there's some common ground in terms of nobody wants to see nuclear war. I think that's pretty given. Nobody, nobody wants to actually use nuclear weapons. But then, of course, there's still a huge gap between the people that think it's still legitimate to possess them and threaten with them and have them as a power tool, and the ones that don't think that's a legitimate option. And I think that very often we've had the conversations only on the nuclear armed states terms. And to me, this is so similar to all the other conversations where you have a very powerful actor and people that are less powerful in that context, right? And the people in power gets to dominate the conversation. They get to be the ones that their perspective take precedence. And I think that's one of the most significant contributions of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that it has empowered countries without nuclear weapons to have a voice. Because I think it's really important in particular for people maybe in nuclear armed states, to understand that this is my security too, right? This is, I'm a Swede in Switzerland, me and my family and my country will be impacted if there's nuclear war too. And the fact I never consented to the US and Russia deciding my fate, right? I don't get to vote. I don't get to be a part of those kind of conversations. So in many ways, it's also it's kind of an obligation for other people to think about the consequences that they have on other countries. Sia talked about the research that's shown India and Pakistan, for example. The fact that can knock out food production for decades in advance means that this is the responsibility for everyone. And in that way, it's very similar to the climate change conversation. You can't just say that, okay, my country will do the right thing, but let's ignore the other ones. It doesn't work like that. This threat does not know borders. It doesn't stop at borders. It doesn't stop with generations. It will continue for the next generations as well. So I think that's something that the nuclear armed states, both the politicians and also the public in those countries, need to really think about. And to kind of understand that their decision is actually having a huge impact on others. I think it's also really important to remember that the majority of countries in the world do not have nuclear weapons. It's very easy to talk about it as they have existed, you know, they will always exist. There's no other options. For pretty much all other countries in the world, they are having their security, you know, dealt with without threatening to use weapons of mass destruction. So that's also one of those things, sort of starting points. I think also there's, of course, a huge amount of common ground in that there is a recognition from everyone that more nuclear weapons isn't more secure. I mean, that's why we have the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's why we like the world recognize, even the nuclear arms state recognize that, you know, everyone having nuclear weapons isn't actually a good idea. And I think that that inherently kind of also recognizes that deterrence isn't flawless. I think that's also very important to remember that even the nuclear arms states, even the one, you know, they don't want other countries to have nuclear weapons because they recognize that if nuclear weapons meant peace, then why don't we all have it? So I think it's really those kind of things I think we can talk about. I think it's really important to start questioning this kind of almost religious belief in that nuclear weapons are great for us, but not for others. And all that also stems from, I saw a couple of questions about the racism and that thing. I think it also comes from a very sort of a privileged point of view that we are responsible with these weapons and others are not responsible. And you can trust us, mainly Western countries, white countries, and you know, Middle Eastern countries or African countries would be very dangerous with nuclear weapons. You know, why do we think that North Korea is more dangerous with nuclear weapons than the United States? I mean, so far North Korea has not used nuclear weapons and the United States did. So I think that the kind of thinking around who gets to take these decisions need to change. So yeah, I think that there's obviously a lot of conversations that need to happen, but the fundamental challenge for the nuclear arms states will be to kind of recognize that this is not a sustainable situation for the long term. And at some point, someone is going to have to get rid of nuclear weapons. If we keep them forever, they will eventually be used, right? So someone in the United States eventually has to make the decision that, yeah, we should get rid of these. So the question is, are we going to do it now? Or are we going to wait for catastrophe to happen, for nuclear war to happen? Are we going to do it after? I think the pandemic has shown again, like how it's so easy to postpone these things. Everyone knew that a pandemic was going to come. The scientists knew, the experts knew. Same thing with scientists and experts know that the risk of nuclear war is increasing. Eventually it will happen if we don't do it. So are we going to do it now? Are we going to leave it to our kids, their kids? Someone is going to have to step up and do it.
Thank you so much. This has been so informative. And unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to give a big thank you to all of our panelists, Zia Mian, Michael Clare, Beatrice Finn, Denise Duffield, and Tom Countryman for an excellent Q&A session. And I want to thank all of you in our audience for your great questions. We will make a recording of the panel discussion and Q&A available on the Back from the Brink website in the near future, and slides will be available on the Back from the Brink site as well. This concludes the policy briefing portion of our program, but we're not done yet. After a short break, we will begin the interactive breakout workshops via Zoom meetings, where you can get even more information and begin translating the ideas that were discussed during the policy briefing into meaningful action at the grassroots level.